The badge was white plastic, the cheap kind with a pin soldered to a bar on the back, and my husband put it on me himself. We were standing just inside the doors of the Lincoln Tower lobby in downtown Fort Wayne, under the brass and the black granite and the fan-shaped lights that have been throwing the same shadows on that ceiling since before either of us was born. It was the second Friday of October, the annual Gala. 240 people in that room, and the coat check girl was close enough that I could see the elastic band on her wrist. Garrett took the fabric of my dress between two fingers, lifted it away from my shoulder, and pushed the pin through it. He did it the way a man closes a latch he has closed 1,000 times without looking, without hurrying with the small mechanical patience of somebody who has never once been told no by the thing he is handling. The badge said volunteer. Under the word there was a number 47 printed in a smaller font by a machine that had printed 46 of them before it, and probably 100 after. There was no name on it. There was no name on it anywhere, not on the front, not on the little paper insert behind the plastic, not on the clip. And I stood there in the doorway of a building I had driven past for 34 years, and understood that there was no piece of paper in the entire place with my name on it. I asked him why I could not simply stand next to him. I said it quietly. I want that on the record. I did not raise my voice. I did not take his arm. I did not make a face. 34 years teaches you a very precise economy of asking. You learn to spend the question at the exact moment it has the best chance of being answered, and you learn to spend it in the smallest possible amount of sound. Garrett straightened his lapel. He had a way of doing that which was not really about the lapel. It was about buying 2 seconds and letting you understand that the 2 seconds belonged to him. I buried a better woman than you this morning, he said, and she had the decency to stay out of the room. Then he walked into his own party. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in the 4 or 5 seconds after that, because if I am not honest about it, then everything that comes later will sound like courage, and it was not courage. It was arithmetic. I stood there, and I felt the pin against my collarbone, and I did the arithmetic I had been doing since 1992. What does it cost to answer him? What does it cost to follow him? What does it cost to take this badge off and set it on the coat check counter and walk out onto Berry Street in October with no coat, no car keys, and no money that he had not put into the account himself? The answer was the same as it had always been. It cost more than I had. So I did what I did. I went where he had put me, which was the hallway by the coats. You have to understand the geometry of that room to understand the geometry of my marriage. The Lincoln Tower lobby is a long rectangle, and the good part of it, the part with the lights and the bar and the little raised platform where the speakers stand, is at the south end. At the north end, there is a corridor that runs back toward the freight elevator and the service door, and on gala nights they set up the coat racks along that corridor because it is out of the way. The air there smells like wet wool in October. The music arrives a half-second late and softer the way music sounds through a wall. That is where I spent the first hour and 40 minutes. I did not sit down because there was nowhere to sit. I stood with my back near the wall and my hands in front of me, and after a while my hands became a problem. That is a thing nobody tells you about being placed somewhere. Your hands need a job. If they do not have one, they start to look like an apology. There was a folding table by the second rack with a tray on it, an empty round tray of the kind the caterers use, and I picked it up. I did not pick it up as a plan. I picked it up because my hands had to go somewhere. A man in a gray suit came back for his phone, saw the tray, and set his glass on it without breaking his sentence. He said thank you to the air in front of him. 9 or 10 minutes later, a woman with a beaded jacket did the same thing, and she at least looked at me, and what she said was that the shrimp was going fast. The third one was a young man who apologized. He said sorry, and he said it twice, and he put his glass down carefully, as if the care made a difference, and he went back into the light. 3 glasses. Not one of them asked me my name, and I want to be fair here because I have gone over that hour many times since, and I have decided that they were not cruel. They were doing the thing people do, which is to read a room the way the room has been arranged for them, and the room had been arranged so that a woman standing near the coats with a badge on her chest and a tray in her hands was a function and not a person. Garrett did not have to say a word to any of them. He had said it all with a pin. 34 years of marriage, and that was the room he had finally brought me to. Somebody should explain to you why I was there at all, because for 34 years I had not been. In all that time, Garrett had allowed me next to him in public exactly 3 times, and I could tell you the date of each. Our wedding at the courthouse in October of 1992, which does not really count because there were 11 people. The dedication of the Waynedale Chapel in 1997, where I stood at the end of the row and held his coat. And the funeral of a man named Roscoe Ambler in 2011, who had been on the board and who had liked me, and whose widow asked for me by name in a way that made it impossible for Garrett to say no. That was the list. 34 years, 3 entries. And then in June, everything under him changed hands. I did not learn about the sale from my husband. I learned about it from a folded copy of the business section that Nadine Culp brought over from her side of the hedge, holding it out at arm's length the way you hand somebody a wasp. Nadine had lived next to us since 2006, and she was the only person Garrett had never managed to remove from my life, mostly because she did not require his permission to exist. She stood in my kitchen with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and she said, "Junia, is this yours?" The paper said that a holding company out of Indianapolis had been acquired. Under that holding company, in a list of 11 subsidiaries in 6-point type, was Whitlock Memorial Group. 4 funeral homes, 2 cemeteries, 1 monument shop, 1 crematory, and a pre-need trust with the article said some 1,800 active contracts. The number would turn out to be 1,904, but that is later. My husband was not the owner anymore. He had never been the owner outright, though he had spent 34 years arranging his sentences so that you would think he was. He held a minority stake and he ran the operating side, and what the sale meant in the plain language that Garrett would never use in his own house was that a man he had never met now had the authority to keep him or to end him. The new ownership sent out a letter in August. I know because I saw it on the counter for 11 days face up, which was unusual. Garrett did not leave things face up. The letter was mostly the kind of paragraph that says nothing, but near the bottom there was a line about the October Gala, and the line said that attendance was required for all officers and senior directors, that the event would function as an introduction, and that officers were expected to attend with their spouse. It said the guest list would be compiled from personnel records, and that the office should be notified of any correction by the 1st of September. Spouse, compiled from personnel records. For 34 years, my husband had kept me out of every room that mattered, and the thing that finally pulled me out of that house was a paragraph written by a man who did not know I existed. I have thought about that a great deal. There is no version of this where Garrett chose to bring me. He was carried into it by somebody above him, and he responded the only way a man like that can respond, which is to comply with the letter and destroy the spirit. Bring the wife. Fine. Bring her pin a number on her and put her by the coats. I read that paragraph 4 times over the course of 11 days, standing at the counter, never touching the page. That was a rule that had never been spoken and had never needed to be. Things on Garrett's counter were not mine to pick up, but I read it, and on the 4th reading I understood why it had been sitting there face up for 11 days instead of going into the office with him on the first morning. He had left it out because he was arguing with it. That is a strange thing to be able to know about a man, but I knew it. Garrett Whitlock never left a problem in a drawer. He set it somewhere he would pass it, and he walked by it and he worked on it in the small increments of a man circling a bad tooth with his tongue. The problem was not the Gala. The problem was the word spouse and the phrase compiled from personnel records, because those 2 things together meant that a list existed somewhere in Indianapolis with my name typed on it, and that a correction had to be filed in writing by the 1st of September if the name was wrong. He could not file a correction. The name was not wrong. On the 12th day, the letter was gone off the counter, and I never saw it again, and I did not think about it once more until the 2nd Friday of October, when it turned out to be the reason I was standing in a hallway with a tray in my hands. He told me about it on a Tuesday. He came into the kitchen while I was pulling the tape off a case of paper napkins, and he said we were going to a thing downtown on the 9th. And he said it the way he announced most things in the middle of doing something else with his eyes on his phone. I asked if I should get something to wear. He looked up then. He had a particular way of looking at me that was not looking exactly. It was assessment. It was the expression of a man checking whether an item is presentable enough to be seen in his vehicle. He said nothing that draws the eye. I bought a navy dress, not at a consignment shop because Garrett would have known. He knew the amount in the account to the dollar every month, and he knew what things cost. And a woman who spends $31 on a dress is a woman announcing something. I bought a navy dress on sale at Glenbrook for $140, which was inside the range of what he considered dignified. And I stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom on the 9th of October, and I did the thing I had done for years, which was to look at my own face and try to place it. I was 63 years old. My hair had gone gray at the temples in my 40s, and white the rest of the way in my 50s, and I had been cutting it myself straight across at the jaw since 2015. My reading glasses hung on a chain. My hands looked like my mother's hands. And somewhere behind the eyes, very far back, there was still a woman of 25 who had sat in the front of a courtroom in the Allen County Courthouse with a machine in her lap and taken down every word that 8 men said and had been faster and more accurate than any of them would have believed if you had told them in advance. That woman was not gone. That is the part I did not understand until October. I thought she was gone. She was not gone. She was in a box in the attic with the machine. I want to give you 3 things about the 34 years, and then I will get back to the room because if I try to tell you all of it, we will be here until spring, and because that is not how it worked anyway. It did not happen as a story. It happened as objects. The first object is the machine. I was licensed as a court reporter in the state of Indiana in the spring of 1988. It is not a job most people can describe. You sit at the front of the room on a chair that is lower than everybody else's, with a stenotype in your lap, and you write phonetically at a speed that has nothing to do with typing. To sit for the certification, you have to hold accuracy at speeds that make a normal person's hands stop working. Peg Larkin, who taught me, used to say that the machine is not the skill. The skill is that you stop listening for meaning and start listening for sound. And if you do it right, meaning arrives later on the page without your permission. I worked in that courthouse from 1988 to the fall of 1994. 6 years. I took down custody hearings and drainage disputes and 2 homicides and 1 long ugly matter involving a grain elevator. I was very good. I know how that sounds. I am 63 years old, and I have not said it out loud in 3 decades, and I am going to say it once I was very good. Garrett ended it in October of 1994. He did not forbid it. He never forbade anything because forbidding creates a record, and a man in his line of work understands records better than anybody. What he did was arrive at the conclusion in front of me out loud, the way he arrived at all conclusions, and then wait for me to agree with it. He said the work put me in rooms with a certain kind of person. He said, and I remember the exact phrasing because I have turned it over so many times that the edges are smooth that it accustomed me to filth. He said that men in his business live and die on how the community sees the wife. He said that a woman who spends her days writing down what people do to each other stops being able to comfort them. I said the money was good. He said that we did not need the money, and that was true, and it was also the whole of it. We did not need the money, which meant that the only reason for me to work was that I wanted to, and wanting to was not a reason that had standing in that house. I gave my notice on a Friday. Peg drove down from Auburn and took me to lunch and asked me what I was going to do instead. And I said I did not know yet, and she looked at me over the top of her cup for a long moment and did not say the thing she was thinking. I did not talk to Peg Larkin again for 32 years. The machine came home in its case. It sat in the hall closet for about a year, and then Garrett said something about the closet needing to be usable, and I carried it up the pull-down stairs into the attic myself. I put it on the north side under the eave next to a box of my mother's things. I did not open the case again. The second object is a number. On the first business day of every month from March of 1993 forward, Garrett moved a fixed amount into an account with my name on it. He described it as an allowance in the beginning, and later he stopped describing it at all, which is what happens to arrangements once they are established. The amount was the amount. It never rose. It never fell. It did not move for the housing crash or for the years when the funeral homes did well or for the year gas went past $4. It did not move when my mother died, and it did not move when I turned 60. 33 years is 404 deposits, and every one of them was the same number. I want to be careful about how I say this next part because there is a version of it that sounds like nothing. It was not nothing. When the amount never changes, what you learn is not that the amount is fixed. What you learn is that you are fixed. You are a line item that has been set correctly and does not require review. Somewhere in a book in a hand that is not yours, you were priced once in 1993, and the price was found to be accurate, and no event in the following 3 decades was significant enough to reopen the question. I got very good at living inside it. That is the part I am least proud of, and the part I understand best. I knew which purchases would produce a comment at dinner, and which would not. I knew that anything over $60 in one place would produce a question, and that 4 purchases of $40 would not, and I knew this the way you know the layout of a house in the dark. There is a kind of competence that grows in a cage, and I had it, and it is worth exactly nothing outside the cage. The third object is a password. We had joint accounts. I want to be clear because when I finally told this to a lawyer, she asked me the same question 3 times, and I could see her not believing me. My name was on the accounts. My name was on the house. My name was on the vehicle. Indiana is not a state where a wife owns nothing, and Garrett was far too careful a man to build something that would look like control if you laid it out on a table. I simply did not know a single password. He set them up. He changed them, he said quarterly for security. When something needed to be paid, he paid it. When something needed to be signed, he brought it to the kitchen table with the signature line already showing and a pen already lying across it, and he stood there while I signed and he took it away. Do you know how many times in 34 years I signed a document I had read all the way through? I have thought about this, and my honest answer is that I do not know, and that not knowing is the answer. That is the shape of it. A machine in the attic. A number that never moved. A house full of accounts I could not open. If somebody had asked me on the 9th of October what my life was, I would have said it was quiet. That is the word I had trained myself to use. Quiet. It is a very good word for what happened to me because it describes the sound and says nothing about the cause. The hall by the coats got busier around 8 because that is when people start deciding whether to leave, and then it got quiet again, and I stood there with the tray, and I watched my husband through the gap in the racks. I was different out there. Every man like that is, but you never get used to seeing it. At home, Garrett spoke at a volume calibrated to be just under the volume of the room so that people leaned in. Out there, he was loud. He laughed a full second before the end of other people's jokes. He touched shoulders. He put his hand flat on the back of a man's arm and held it there while he talked, and the man kept trying to step back, and Garrett kept the hand where it was. He looked, I thought, like a man selling something to people who had already bought it. Twice people came back to the corridor and stood near the racks to say things they did not want said in the light, and neither of them thought about me at all, which is the only real privilege that comes with a badge like that. The first pair were younger men from one of the West Side homes, and what they were saying was that nobody had actually met the new one yet, that he had come up through quarries, that his people had been in limestone in Lawrence County for 4 generations, and that he had bought the holding company for reasons no one could explain, because there is no money in a group that size, and there never has been. One of them said the word cash and made a sound with his teeth. The second was a woman in her 50s who had her phone against her ear, and what she said was, "He's not staying for the remarks. He never stays for remarks." And then she said, "No, listen to me. He does not shake more than one hand at a table." I filed all of it. I did not mean to. That is the thing I keep coming back to about that hour. You can take a woman out of a courtroom and put her against a wall for 32 years, and she will still, without being asked, take down what the room says when it thinks it is alone. At about 20 past 8, Darcy came through. I need to tell you about Darcy in the right order, because there is no fair way to tell you what she did later if you do not know what she was to me first. Darcy Whitlock is my husband's niece, his younger brother's girl. In the spring of 1993, that brother went off the road on 24 near New Haven and did not come back, and Darcy's mother had been gone since Darcy was 3, and there was a week in that April when the entire adult world sat in our front room and talked about the child in the third person, while she sat on the stairs and listened, because that is what people do. I had been married 7 months. I was 30 years old. I had lost my own 3 years before, and I had not told a living soul, and I sat on those stairs with a girl who was 8 and said none of the useful things, and after about 10 minutes she put her head against my arm. She came to us in May of 1993, and she stayed until she was 19. I raised her. I want to use that word, and I want to be allowed to keep it. Garrett paid for her, and he was not unkind to her, and he showed up to the things a man shows up to. But I was the one who learned that she could not sleep unless the hall light was on, and I was the one who drove to Warsaw 4 times in one winter for a swim meet, and I was the one who sat on the bathroom floor with her the night she was 17 and thought her life was over, and told her it was not, and was right. She has a nervous habit with a pen. She clicks it. She clicked it through her algebra homework, and she clicked it at her wedding rehearsal in 2011, and she clicks it now at 41 in an office in the building her uncle runs where her title is records manager, which means that every file that group produces passes across her desk on its way to being filed. She came through the corridor at 20 past 8 with a clipboard and a lanyard. She saw me. I want to be accurate rather than dramatic, so I will say only what I can defend. She came around the end of the coat rack. Her eyes went across me, and there was a change in her face. Not shock, something smaller and worse. The kind of adjustment a person makes when they have already decided how to handle a thing and are now handling it. She said hi. I said hello, sweetheart. She said the caterer needed the tray, and I gave her the tray and she took it, and she went back out into the light. She came through again 9 or 10 minutes later, going the other way. That time she did not look over. I stood there without the tray and my hands went back to being a problem. And then the room changed. There is a specific thing that happens to a large room when a certain kind of person comes through the door, and it does not happen all at once. It is not silence. It is a lowering. The 200 conversations do not stop. They drop about a third in volume 1 cluster at a time, moving from the doors inward like something settling. Heads come around. People who have been holding their drinks at their chests move them down to their sides. I could not see the doors from where I was. I could only see the effect, and the effect moved toward me across the room, and I thought, that is the new one. Then I saw Garrett move. He came through the middle of the floor at a speed just under a walk that would embarrass him, and I watched him put his hand out when he was still 4 people away from whoever he was going to. That is the detail I keep. The hand went out early. He extended it into the space in front of a man he could not yet reach, and he carried it that way through the last of the crowd. And I felt something in my chest that was not sympathy, and was not satisfaction either. I had watched that man refuse to stand next to me in public for 3 decades, and there he was carrying his own hand across a room like a bowl of something he was afraid of spilling. The crowd shifted and I saw the new owner for the first time. He was tall. Not the kind of tall that fills a room, the kind that has been slightly apologetic since about 14. Full head of white hair cut short. Heavy through the shoulders in the way of a man who did physical work into his 30s and never entirely lost the shape of it. Dark suit that fit him without any of the vanity that Garrett's suits had. I took my husband's hand. I counted. This is what I mean about the woman in the attic not being gone. Nobody counts by accident. 6 years of taking down testimony leaves you with a metronome you did not ask for, and it started up in me the second I saw the handshake, and I counted 2 seconds. 2 seconds, and then he let go and Garrett was still talking. Garrett was mid-sentence. I know he was mid-sentence because his mouth kept going for a full beat after the hand came loose, and because his other hand had already started to lift toward a gesture that never arrived. The new owner had turned his head. He was looking down the length of the room, not scanning it the way a man looks for the bar or for somebody he is supposed to greet. He was looking at the far end of a rectangle past the tables and the bar and the raised platform into the mouth of a corridor where the light gives out, and he had gone very still. And then he started walking. I have gone over this hundreds of times, and I still cannot tell you what he could actually see from that distance. The light back there is bad. I was against the wall in a navy dress. It is 110 feet, and he was 65 years old, and he was not wearing glasses. He said later that he did not see my face. He said he saw the way somebody was standing. He came the whole length of the floor. People got out of his way without seeming to decide to. He passed the tables. He passed the bar. He passed the platform where the microphone was already set up for the 9 o'clock remarks. Behind him, out in the light, my husband turned around with his mouth still slightly open. The man came into the mouth of the corridor and stopped about 4 feet from me, close enough that I could see the lines at the corners of his eyes and the small white scar through his right eyebrow that he got in 1979, loading a truck in the hands. The hands are what did it. The rest of him had become a stranger, 65 years old and expensive, but the hands were the same hands wide across the knuckle, with the nails cut short and square, and a pale roughness at the sides of the fingers that 36 years of offices had not been able to take out of them. He said my name. He said Junia. I said Lowell. That was all either of us managed for what felt like a long time and was probably 4 seconds. I remember that the music was still playing, and that somebody laughed near the bar high and unaware, and that the coat check girl behind me stopped moving hangers. Then he said something I had not prepared for. In every version of this I had ever allowed myself on the nights when I let myself have a version, he said something about the past. He asked why. He asked where I went. I did not do any of that. He said, "They told me you died in 1990. I heard the words. I want you to understand that I heard them clearly and that they did not mean anything at all for a moment. They arrived as sound and stood there." I said, "What?" "May of 1990, he said. I was in Bloomington. My father called me. Then a firm sent a package to our office." His voice was under control in the way a voice is when a man is holding it down with both hands. "By the time I got back here, it was already done." "There was no service," I said. "There was a card," he said, and he reached inside his jacket and took out his wallet. I have thought a great deal about the fact that it was in his wallet. Not in a drawer at his house. Not in a box in an attic under an eave, which is where I keep things. In the wallet that was on his body in October of 2026 at a business function in a suit he had put on that evening. The wallet was worn pale at the fold. He opened it, and his hands were not steady. He got 2 fingers into the section behind the cards and brought out a small piece of paper that had been folded into quarters, and I watched him open it, and the creases did not crack. That is what I noticed. Paper that has been folded once and left alone for 36 years cracks along the fold. This paper did not crack. It opened soft. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone to cloth. He turned it around and held it up so that it caught the light from the lobby. It was a memorial card. 4 inches by 6 ivory stock with a border of small pressed flowers along the left side. I knew the stock. Anyone in that family knows the stock. It has a fine mineral fleck in it, a faint gray grain suspended in the paper, and Whitlock had used that same stock since the 70s because Garrett's father liked the way it held ink. Across the front of it in a serif face was my name, Junia Ann Prewitt. Under my name were 2 years the year I was born, and a year that was not the year I was born, joined by a small mark that meant everything a small mark can mean. And in the bottom corner in 6-point type, in the place where it always goes, was the name of the funeral home. My husband's funeral home. The one his father started on Broadway in 1961, and the one Garrett had been the licensed director of since 1985. I did not take it from him. I want that recorded too. I stood with my hands at my sides and read my own memorial card off the palm of a man I had not seen since I was 27, and the thing my mind did was not any of the things you would expect. My mind read it like a document. That is what 6 years in a courtroom does to you, and it does not wear off, and standing in that corridor with the wet wool smell and the music coming through the wall, some old machinery in me came up out of the floor and started working, and it did not care at all how I felt. It said the stock is ours. It said that typeface is the one the shop used before they changed systems in 2001. It said memorial cards are printed against a service record. It said a service record is opened from a death record. It said in this state the person who completes the death record and files it with the local health officer is not the doctor and is not the family. It is the funeral director. It said in the flat voice that had taken down the worst days of other people's lives without ever once shaking somebody signed for this. There is a thing that happens to your body when it receives information it has no procedure for. Everybody describes it as cold, and it is not cold. It is a sort of removal. The floor was still under me, and the pin was still against my collarbone, and I could hear the coat check girl not moving, and at the same time some part of me had stepped back about 2 feet and was watching a woman in a navy dress look at a piece of paper. I remember thinking very clearly that I should ask him a question, and then finding that I had no idea which one. There were 4 or 5, and they were all the same size, and I could not get one of them out in front of the others. What I finally said was, "Who gave that to you?" "A man brought it," Lowell said, "to the firm, in June." He stopped and corrected himself, and I watched him do it, and I understood that he had told this to himself so many times that even the sequence had become sacred to him. The call came in May. The package came in June. There was a copy of the certificate in it, and this, and a photograph. A photograph of what? I said. He did not answer that, and his not answering was worse than any answer, because I had already understood what the third item in a package like that would have to be. And I stood there and let myself understand it all the way, and my hands started shaking for the first time that night. Behind Lowell, out in the light, my husband was coming. I saw him over Lowell's shoulder, moving through the last of the crowd, and I braced. I knew what was coming because I had 34 years of data. He would take my arm above the elbow. He would apply exactly as much pressure as could be denied afterward. He would smile at the other man while he did it, and in the car he would not speak, and at the house he would not speak, and sometime around 11 the next morning he would make a remark about the dress. That is not what happened, and the fact that it is not what happened is the reason I am telling you any of this. Garrett arrived at my right shoulder. He put his hand flat on my back, high up between the shoulder blades, which is a gesture that photographs as tenderness. He was slightly out of breath, and he was smiling, and he pitched his voice at a level I had heard him use 10,000 times the level for a room, and not for a person. Loud enough for the 3 tables nearest the corridor. Loud enough for the coat check girl. Loud enough for Darcy, who had stopped 10 feet away with her clipboard against her chest. He said, "Mr. Ashby, I'm so sorry, she gets confused." Nobody moved. "It comes and goes," my husband said in the warm, tired, patient voice of a good man carrying something heavy. "It's been a hard year for us. I'm going to take her home. I have been asked since more than once by people whose job it is to ask whether I said anything. I did not say anything. And people want that to be fear, and part of it was fear because his hand was on my back. But I have to be truthful about the larger part, because the larger part is the whole point. In 34 years, my husband had never once said that about me. Not to a doctor, not to Nadine, not to Darcy, not to me. He had called me quiet. He had called me sensitive. He had said I did not understand the business. He had never said I was confused. He had never suggested in front of witnesses in a lobby full of people whose names were on a list that my mind was going. And a man like Garrett Whitlock does not reach for a new tool at 8:40 on a Friday night out of temper. He reached for it because he needed it, and because he intended to use it again, and because it works better if the first time anybody hears it, it comes out of him sounding sad in a room with 240 witnesses. I stood there with a badge on my chest that had a number and no name holding nothing, and I watched my husband set the first brick. I did not know yet what he was building. I knew all the way down that he had started. I did not speak in the car. I had been reading that silence for 34 years, and I could usually tell you within a minute or two how long it would hold and what it would turn into on the other side. There was the silence that ended at the garage door. There was the silence that lasted through the night and broke at breakfast in the form of a remark about something unrelated. There was the long one, the one that could go 4 or 5 days, where he would say good morning and ask about the mail and hand me things, and every word would be perfectly ordinary, and none of them would be to me. This was not any of those. This one had a different quality, and I could not place it, and it took me until Sunday to understand why. I was not angry. He drove us up Clinton with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and at the light, by the bridge, he cleared his throat and adjusted the mirror, and there was nothing coming off him at all. No heat. When Garrett was angry, the air in a car got thick, and you could feel it on your face like the side of a stove. That night the car was just a car. At the house, he came around and opened my door, which he had not done in 20 years. He hung up my coat. He asked if I wanted tea. He said in the voice of a man being gentle with someone that it had been a long night, and that I should not worry about the kitchen, and that he would take care of it in the morning. I said I was going up. He said, "Junia." I stopped on the second stair. "You didn't understand what was happening tonight," he said. "That's all right, but you should know that I'm not upset with you. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did standing on that stair with my hand on the rail. I'm not upset with you." He had told 240 people that my mind was failing, and now he was standing in his own front hall being kind to me about it. Not covering, not backpedaling, building. I went up and I lay in the dark on my side of a bed I had shared with him since the first Bush administration, and I did not sleep, and what came up out of the floor of me was not the Gala at all. It was 1986. There is a thing they do not tell you about the past. They tell you it comes back in pieces. It does not, or it did not for me. It came back whole in order at speed, the way a room comes back when somebody turns the light on, and I lay there for 6 hours and watched all of it, and I could not stop it, and by 4 in the morning I was not sure I wanted to. I met Lowell Ashby in the second week of April in 1987 in the Allen County Courthouse on the 4th floor in a hearing about where a line was. I was 24. I was not a court reporter yet. I want that exactly right, because it matters to the shape of things, and because for 6 years afterward, I was a professional in that building, and I do not want anyone confusing the two. In 1987, I was a student in Peg Larkin's program, and what Peg did with her students, which was not common, and which I have never seen anyone else do, was put them in real rooms. She would take 3 of us at a time, and sit us along the wall behind the rail with our machines in our laps, and let us write live. No status, no record. Our notes went nowhere, and were read by nobody but her. She said that speed drills teach your hands, and only a live room teaches your nerve, and that the difference between a reporter and a fast typist is what happens in your chest the first time a man starts crying while he is still talking. Peg was 32 then. She had a gray streak coming in at the front that she was pleased about, and she wore reading glasses on a chain, and I have worn my glasses on a chain since I was 35, without ever once admitting to myself where I got it. The hearing was a boundary matter. 2 limestone operations south of the county line, an old deed with a call to a creek. And the creek in the way of creeks had moved. It had moved 40 feet west sometime between 1911 and 1974, and had taken about 9 acres of somebody's stone with it, and 11 people were in that room arguing about whether the line follows the water or the water follows the line. I have never in my life been so interested in anything. That sounds ridiculous. I know how it sounds. But I was 24, and I was working the 11 to 7 at a commercial laundry on Coliseum running sheets for 2 hospitals and 4 hotels, and I came off that shift and went home and slept 4 hours and came to that courtroom, and there was a man on the stand with a doctorate explaining how a bed of limestone lies down under the ground in sheets, and how the good stone, the stone you can actually sell, is one particular horizon of it, maybe 60 feet thick, and how it does not care in the slightest where a creek is. The young man at the plaintiff's table was 26 years old and did not speak once all morning. I noticed him because he was the only person in that room who was not performing. Everyone else had a posture. The lawyers had theirs, and the witnesses had theirs, and the 2 older men at the tables had the particular posture of men who have already decided that the other one is a liar. He sat with his forearms on the table and listened, and twice he wrote something down, and once when the man with the doctorate said something about the way the stone parts along the bed. He closed his eyes for a second. At the recess, I went out to the hall to shake out my hands. That is a real thing. You cross your fingers backward and press, and it hurts. And if you do not do it, your 3rd hour is worse than your 2nd. I was standing by the window. He said, "Are you writing that on a machine?" I said I was. He asked how it worked. I have thought about that a great many times over the years, and I have decided that there is nothing romantic about it at all, which is why it worked. He did not tell me I was interesting. He did not offer me anything. He asked a technical question about a piece of equipment, and then he stood there and let me answer it. And I explained about writing phonetically, and about how there are 22 keys, and you press them in combinations, and a stroke is a syllable, not a letter, and how the theory is that meaning has to be taken out of the front of the process and put back in at the end, and how that is the whole thing, that is the entire job. You stop listening for what people mean, and you listen only for the sounds they make. He asked how you keep from understanding it. I said you do not at first. I said that for the first year you understand everything, and it ruins you, and then one day it stops, and the words go through your ears and out your hands, and you are not in the middle of it anymore. He said, "And then what happens to it?" I said it comes back later, on the page, when you read it with your name at the bottom. He looked at the floor for a while, and then he said that was the strangest thing he had ever heard, and that he thought about his own work the same way. And I said, "What is your work?" And he said, "Stone." And that was the entire conversation. 11 minutes. The bailiff called us back in. I was there the next morning, and he brought me a coffee and did not make anything of it. He put it on the rail at my elbow and went and sat down. That was Lowell. His people had been in limestone in Lawrence County since 1889. 4 generations. I did not know that for weeks, and when I did find out, it did not mean to me what it should have because I was 24 and from the north side of Fort Wayne, and my father drove a truck. And the word quarry did not sound like money to me. It sounded like a hole. My father was Hollis Prewitt. He hauled stone. That is the joke of it, and it is not a small joke, and I did not find out for 2 more years exactly how small a world it was. He ran a flatbed under his own authority, and about 1/3 of his year was Lawrence County block coming north, and he had been doing it since 1968, and every October he sat at the kitchen table with a renewal and a pen and made the same joke about how he worked for the Rock. My mother was Verna. She had been in and out of the county hospital since 1986 with her heart. There was a payment arrangement. I do not want to go into what a payment arrangement did to a family like ours in 1987, except to say that it was the first and last thing my mother thought about every day for 5 years, and that she never once mentioned it in front of my father. Lowell and I did not have a courtship that would make a film. We had 18 months of the wrong hours. I was on the 11 to 7 until the following March, and then I sat for my certification and passed and went to work in that courthouse for real, and he was driving back and forth from Bedford. And what we mostly did was talk on the telephone at hours when nobody is at their best and eat in places that were open. It was not what people think when they hear that a girl from the laundry got engaged to a family with 4 generations of anything. He drove a truck with 160,000 miles on it. He had a bad shoulder from a loader. He had gone to Indiana University and come home and gone straight down the hole because his father, Carlisle Ashby, believed that a man who has not cut stone has no business selling it, and he had spent 2 years on a channeler and had the hands to prove it. He asked me to marry him in July of 1989 at the lake behind the campus in Bloomington, which was an hour and a half out of his way, and which he had chosen because I had once said something in passing about wanting to see it. The ring had been his grandmother's. I have to describe it, and I do not have a good way to do it. The stone was not a stone in the way people mean. It was limestone. Oolitic Salem limestone, out of their own ground cut and polished into a small flat oval about the size of a thumbnail set in silver. And it was the pale warm gray that goes almost gold under a lamp. And if you turned it in the light, you could see the grain in it all. Those tiny fossil shells packed together, a shallow sea that had been sitting there for 330 million years, waiting for somebody to make a ring out of it. He put it on my finger and his hands were shaking, and he said something about how it was not a real ring, and how he would get me a real one, and I said, "Do not you dare." I said yes at 9 o'clock at night on the 14th of July in 1989, and I was 26 years old, and I wanted in the record, since I am putting things in the record, that I was happy. Completely. Without any part of me held back. I have had a long life, and I have been content, and I have been at peace, and I have been useful, and I am telling you that there is a difference between those things and the other thing, and I had the other thing for 6 months. The call came in the second week of January in 1990. It was not a call from Lowell. It was a call from a firm on Berry Street, Tolliver and Reed, and the voice on the phone was a young woman who said that Mr. Tolliver would appreciate a few minutes of my time on Thursday at 10 regarding a family matter. I have wondered what would have happened if I had said no. I did not know that I could say no. That is not an excuse, it is a fact about being 27 and from where I was from in 1990. A firm calls you and says a name you have heard and you go. There were 3 men in that room, and none of them was Lowell. Ward Tolliver was about 60, and he was courteous the entire time, and that is the part that people do not believe. There was no shouting. Nobody threatened me. I want to describe what actually happened, because the actual thing is worse than the version with shouting. Carlisle Ashby did most of the talking, and he began by telling me that he had made inquiries and that he had found nothing about me that was not respectable. He said that. He said it like a gift. He said his son was 28 and had a great deal of responsibility coming to him, and that a family business is not a business, it is a chain, and that every man on it holds it for a while and hands it on. Then he laid 3 things on the table, and he laid them one at a time, and between each one he waited. The first was a folder with my father's hauling agreement in it. He did not read from it. He did not have to. He said that Hollis Prewitt had been carrying block for them since 1968, and that it was renewed every October, and that they had never had a complaint. He said, and this is very close to exact, that he hoped nothing would ever change about that. The second was my mother. He said the county hospital had a board, and that he had sat on it for 11 years, and that he understood the family had an arrangement, and that arrangements are a courtesy, and that courtesies are reviewed. The third was a check. He did not slide it across. He put it down face up in front of him on his own side of the table, so that I could see that it was a check, and could not read what was written on it, and he left his hand near it. Nobody said a number out loud. To this day I do not know what was on it. That was deliberate, and it was the cleverest thing in the room, because it meant that for 36 years I have never been able to say that I turned down a specific amount of money. I turned down a rectangle. I reached across the table and picked it up and tore it in half, and then in half again, and put the pieces down. Ward Tolliver looked at his hands. Carlisle Ashby did not react at all, and I understood even then at 27 in a room where I had no standing that he had expected me to do that, and that it had not cost him anything because the check was never the point. The check was there so that the other 2 things would look like the reasonable part. I said I would think about it. He said that he would like to be able to tell his son that his own family had nothing to do with it. And that was the whole of it. That was the only thing he actually asked me for. Not that I go away. That I go away in a manner that left his son believing it had been my idea. I did it. I broke it off 11 days later on the 22nd of January on the phone because I could not do it with him in front of me, and I knew it. I said we were too different. I said I had been pretending about a lot of things. I said the words that would do the most damage in the shortest time because I could not have stood a conversation. I told him not to come, and he came anyway that night and stood in the parking lot of my building for a long time, and I stood in the dark on the 2nd floor, about 11 feet above him, with my hand over my mouth, and did not turn on a light. I mailed the ring back to Bedford on the 24th. Certified. I have the receipt. I still have the receipt. I was 9 weeks pregnant. I found out on the 21st of December in 1989, 3 weeks before that meeting, from a doctor on Lake Avenue who congratulated me. I had not told Lowell yet. He was in Bedford through the holiday, and his father had him in the office every day of it, and I had decided that a thing like that does not get said on a telephone. I had an entire plan about how I was going to tell him, and it involved his grandmother's ring and a stupid thing I was going to say, and I have never told another human being what the stupid thing was, and I am not going to start now. I did not tell Carlisle Ashby either in that room with the check on the table. I have gone over that decision for 36 years, and I can tell you exactly why I did not, and the reason is not noble. I did not tell him because I understood sitting there that if I said it, everything would change and nothing would improve. He would not have withdrawn a single one of the three things. He would have added a fourth. So I carried it out of that office and down the stairs and onto Berry Street in January, and I did not tell anybody, and I went to work. I worked the whole time. That is the part that people find strange. I sat in the front of that courtroom through February and March, and into April 4 and 5 days a week, and I took down every word, and my hands did not fail once. Peg Larkin, who missed nothing, asked me in March whether something was wrong, and I said no. And she looked at me the way she looked at me at that lunch 4 years later, and did not say the thing she was thinking. On the 11th of April in 1990, I was 20 weeks along. It was a Wednesday. I was at home. It began at about 2 in the afternoon, and I want to be careful here because there are people listening to this who have been in that room and do not need me to walk them through it, and there are people who have not and do not need it either. I will say that it began with pain that I told myself was something else for about 40 minutes, and that when I finally stood up, there was blood, and that I drove myself. I drove myself 16 minutes. They took me back fast. There was a nurse whose name I never got who held my hand and told me to look at her, and not at the door. There was an ultrasound and a silence around the machine that told me before anybody said a word. There was a doctor named Wendell Faust who was on that night, and who was kind to me in a rushed and distracted way, and who wrote things down. It was over a little after 8 in the evening. At 20 weeks, it is not what people who have not been there imagine. At 20 weeks, there is a body. There is a small, complete body, and somebody has to decide what happens to it, and the law decides part of it for you. And in this state, the line is drawn at 20 weeks, and I was on the far side of the line by 11 days. That is what nobody understands about the whole of my life. 11 days. If it had happened at 18 weeks, there would have been no certificate, no report, no filing, no requirement of any kind. And there would have been no reason on this earth for a funeral director to be in that building that night. At 20 weeks, the hospital has to make a report, and the family has to make arrangements. And at 10:30 at night on the 11th of April in 1990, somebody in that hospital picked up a phone and called the home that was on the rotation. He came in at about 11. I remember him standing at the end of the bed in a dark suit at 11 o'clock at night. I remember that his shoes were clean. I have thought about that detail more than any other, and I cannot explain why it has stayed except that everything else in that building at that hour was ruined and scuffed and used, and this man came in from outside with clean shoes and a folder. I was 32 years old. He said his name was Garrett Whitlock. I was very good at it. I have to say that because if I make him a monster in that room, then I am lying, and the lie would be a mercy to myself. He was good at it. He sat down. He did not stand over me. He said that there were some things that had to be decided, and that they did not all have to be decided tonight. He said that most families in this situation choose one of two ways, and that neither one is wrong. He asked whether there was somebody he should call, and I said no, and he did not press. He asked about the father. I said there was no father. He wrote something down, and then he said the sentence that ran my life for 36 years, and he said it kindly, and he was looking at the folder when he said it. He said the hospital can handle this through the county. It's done respectfully. You don't need to know where. You don't need to carry that. I said, are you sure? He said, I do this every week. Let me take care of it. I said, all right. I said, all right, and I signed where he showed me, and I did not read it. And if you have been listening to any part of this, you already know that I did not read it, because that is the woman I was about to become, and that was the first document. I was released the next afternoon. I called in sick for 2 days and went back to work on the Monday. I never told my mother. I never told my father. I never told Peg. I told nobody, and I have not told anybody for 36 years, and I am telling it now in the order it happened, because the order is the only thing that makes the rest of it make sense. He called me in June to ask how I was. That is how it started. He called in June and again in August, and he was patient and he was steady, and he never once asked me a question I did not want to answer. In the fall of 1991, he took me to dinner. In the spring of 1992, he told me that he did not need me to love him yet. And in October of 1992, I married him at the courthouse on Main Street, with 11 people in the room, and I thought and I said to myself in those words that I was choosing peace. I was choosing the man who had been holding the receipt the entire time. I got out of bed at 5:10 on Saturday morning, and went down and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table until the sky went gray. Garrett came down at 7. He was in a sweater. He put his hand on my shoulder as he went past to the coffee pot, and he said good morning, and then he said that he had been thinking, and that he had made me an appointment. I asked with who. He said with a doctor. He said the name of a practice out on DuPont and said it was for a general workup, that we were both getting to an age and that it was the first Tuesday in November because they were busy. I said I felt fine. He said, I know you do. He drank his coffee standing at the window with his back to me and said that Friday night had been difficult and that he was sorry it had happened in front of people and that we would not talk about the man from the party again and that he had handled it. I said handled it. He said it's handled. I went to the office at 9. He worked Saturdays. He had worked Saturdays for 34 years. I waited until his car was out of the drive and I went upstairs and pulled the cord for the attic stairs. I had not been up there since 2019 when I brought down a box of Christmas things and did not take it back up. There is a bare bulb and about 4 feet of headroom under the ridge, and it smelled the way those places smell hot dust and old paper and the particular sweetness of a cardboard box that has been sitting on plywood for 30 years. The case was on the north side, under the eave, where I had put it in the fall of 1995, next to a box with my mother's name on the end of it in my own handwriting. It is a hard-sided case gray with 2 latches, and it weighs about 22 pounds. I carried it down the stairs, one step at a time, both hands the way you carry something you are not going to drop. I put it on the dining room table and I opened it. The machine was exactly as I had left it. 22 keys, the number bar across the top, the tripod folded under. The paper tray was empty. The ribbon was 32 years dry. And I did the thing I had not expected to do and had no reason to do. I sat down at the dining room table in my bathrobe at 9:40 in the morning, and I put my hands on it. Left hand on the initial consonants, right hand on the finals, thumbs on the vowel bar, and my hands went down onto those keys and found their places without any instruction from me at all. The way your feet find the last stair in the dark. And I sat there with my fingers on a dead machine in a silent house, and I started to cry, which I had not done in front of anyone or by myself in a very long time. Underneath the machine in the bottom of the case there was a steno pad, not a legal pad. The narrow fanfold kind that comes out of the back of the machine 4 inches wide, and it was one of my practice pads. And on the cover in ballpoint in my own hand it said practice, and under that a date in 1988, and under that my name, Junia A. Prewitt. I opened it and it was full of steno, pages of it, and I could read it. That is the thing I could not have predicted, and it took the ground out from under me. I looked at those strokes and they came up off the page as words without any effort at all, 32 years later, like a language you were raised in, and I sat there reading a drill I had written when I was 25 years old, about a car accident that never happened, and I thought very clearly in a voice that did not sound like the voice I had been using in that house. You are not a woman who gets confused. The Allen County Health Department is on East Superior, and Vital Records is on the 1st floor, and you take a number. I want to say something about how easy it was, because I had built it up in my head all weekend into something enormous, and it was not enormous. It took 11 minutes and cost $26. Birth and death records in this state are public in the way that matters here. I am the person named on the record. You fill out a short form, you show a driver's license, and you request a certified copy. I asked for my own birth certificate under my maiden name. I did not have a reason ready if anybody asked me why. Nobody asked me why. The woman behind the glass was about 30, and she had a cardigan on, and she said it would be a few minutes and to have a seat. I sat in a molded plastic chair between a young man with a folder and a woman with a toddler asleep against her shoulder. I had told myself in the car that I was doing this to be careful, that I would look at the card again in Lowell's hand in my memory and find that I had misread the name or the years, or that it was a different Prewitt, because Prewitt is not a rare name in this part of the state, and there are 2 families of them in Huntington alone. That is what I told myself. That is not what I was doing, and I knew it because a woman who wants to check a name does not request a certified copy. She called me back to the window, and she slid 2 documents under the glass. 2. I had asked for one. I said, I think there has been a mistake. She said, you asked for everything under that name, ma'am. I had not. I had asked for a birth certificate. I have gone back over it, and I am nearly certain I had asked for a birth certificate. But she had run the name, which is what they do, and the system had returned what it had, and what it had was 2 documents, and she had printed both, and she had charged me for both, and she was already looking past me at the next number. The first one was ordinary, Junia Ann Prewitt, born the 9th of January 1963 at the Lutheran Hospital of Fort Wayne. Hollis Wayne Prewitt father, occupation truck driver. Verna May Prewitt mother. The second one was a certificate of death. I read it standing up at the window with people behind me. I did not sit down. There is a certain kind of shock that puts you into procedure instead of out of it, And I have been told since that this is not the usual response, and I can only say that I was trained. Distant Junia Ann Prewitt, sex female, race white, age 27. Date of birth the 9th of January 1963. Date of death the 11th of April 1980. Social security number unknown. I stopped there. I want to walk you through what I did with that line, because it was the first thing on that page that was not simply horrifying, and it was the first thing that told me what kind of man I had been living with. Unknown. A woman's social security number is not unknown. It is on her employment record, it is on her tax filing, it is in the file of the employer who is paying her. And in 1990, I had been drawing a paycheck from Allen County for 2 years. It could not have been easier to obtain, and there was no version of that night in which it was unavailable to the man filling out that form. He left it blank on purpose, because a death record with a number on it goes up the chain. It gets matched. It reaches the federal file, and the file gets marked, and the woman it belongs to stops being able to hold a job, open an account, or renew a license, and everybody in the world finds out inside of 90 days. A death record without a number sits exactly where it was put. County, state, paper. It is perfectly real. It is certified. It will be produced to anyone who asks for it, and it never once goes looking for the living woman it describes. I did not want me dead. He wanted me dead in one drawer. Cause of death, hemorrhage. I put my hand flat on the counter. Because it was true. That is the part I could not get past then, and cannot get past now. It was true. That is what happened in that hospital on the 11th of April in 1990. That is the word the doctor used, and he had been standing right there at the end of the bed with the folder in his hand while it was said. And he took the true medical facts of the worst day of my life, and he wrote them onto a form and made them mine. Certifying physician Wendell Faust, M.D., the doctor who had been on that night. The doctor who had been kind to me in a rushed way. The doctor whose name was on the real paperwork sitting right there in the folder in a dark suit at 11 o'clock at night, available to be copied. Method of disposition, cremation. Place of disposition, Fairmount Memorial Gardens, Section 14. Informant blank. That is the one that made me sit down, and I did finally sit down in the plastic chair with the 2 pieces of paper in my hand. Informant blank. No next of kin listed anywhere on the document. No father, no mother, no spouse, no sibling, no friend. A 27-year-old woman dies in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and there is not one living human being recorded as having reported it. And down at the bottom on the line for the funeral service licensee in blue ballpoint and handwriting I have looked at on Christmas cards and school forms and refinance papers for 34 years. G. Whitlock, and a license number. Fairmount is out past the airport on a county road 20 minutes from my kitchen, and I had driven past the sign for it about 4,000 times. I did not go home first. I had the 2 certificates on the passenger seat, and I drove out there at 11:30 on a Monday morning in the middle of October with the trees going, and I stopped at the little office by the gate, and a young man with a clipboard walked out to the car, and I heard myself say in a voice that was completely level that I was looking for a plot in Section 14, and gave him the name. He went in and came back with a printed sheet and a photocopied map with a highlighter line on it, and he said Section 14 was up the hill on the left, and he said row 9, and then he said, "Do you want me to walk you up?" I said no thank you. Section 14 is old ground. It is the part of that cemetery that was laid out before they went to flat markers for the mowers. So there are upright stones, small ones mostly, and the grass was still green and there was a lot of leaf down. Ronine, I walked it from the end. 14 stones, and the 15th one was mine. It was limestone. Of course it was limestone in this state, in that county, in that decade, and I had seen 10,000 of them, and I had never once looked at one. And I stood in front of it in a coat I had bought in 2018 and read my own name off a rock. Junia Ann Prewitt. Nothing else. No verse. No relation. Nothing to say she was anybody's anything. And I did the thing that the machine in me does, which does not stop and does not have any decency about it. I looked at the letter forms. Because I had spent 34 years in that family, and there was a monument shop on the property out on Bluffton Road, and that shop had cut lettering the same way from 1968 until they went over to a computer system in the spring of 2001. There is a serif on the capital R with a straight tail that comes off at a shallow angle, and there is a way the numeral 9 sits with its bowl slightly small, and I had seen it on 1,000 stones and on the sample boards in the showroom and on the framed thing in the hallway of the Broadway home. Our shop cut it. My husband did not merely file a paper. He ordered stone and set it, and paid a man to carve my name into it, and then he drove me past that road sign 4,000 times. I got down on my knees in the leaves. I was not praying. I want to be clear because people have assumed since. I got down because my legs went, and once I was down there, I put my hand flat on the front of the stone on the letters, the way you would put your hand on a person's chest. And I heard somebody coming up the row behind me. I did not turn around. I remember thinking with total calm that it was the young man from the office and that he had come to walk me up after all. The footsteps stopped about 6 feet back. Then a voice said, "Junia." He was in work clothes. That is what I noticed first on my knees looking up, not the suit. A canvas coat and boots with white dust in the seams of the leather, and in his left hand a small bunch of flowers, the kind they sell in a bucket at the front of a grocery store still in the paper. I could not speak. "I didn't know where else you'd go," he said. "I couldn't call. There's no listing under your name. There is no listing anywhere under your name." I said there wouldn't be. He came up the row and stopped beside me, and he looked down at the stone, and I watched a 65-year-old man look at something he had looked at every year since he was 29. And I understood that he was seeing it for the first time. Then he crouched down. He put the flowers on the grass. He reached out and put 2 fingers on the top edge of the stone, and then his whole hand flat on the face of it next to mine, and he went completely still. He said, "This is ours." I said, "What?" "This stone." His voice had gone strange. "This is Salem out of the Ashby bed. Look at it." He turned his hand and ran his thumb along the top edge hard, the way you do when you want to feel grain. "It's the buff. You can see the bedding plane run out at the corner there. Nobody north of Bedford was selling this in 1990 but us." I took his hand off the stone and looked at it. "For 36 years, he said, and stopped and started again. "For 36 years I have driven up here on the 11th of April and knelt down in front of a rock that came out of my own ground. Neither of us said anything for a while. Somewhere down the hill a mower was going. Then Lowell Ashby turned his head and looked at me and asked the question that ended one part of my life and started the last one. He said, "Junia, if you're here." He put his hand back on the stone. "Who is in there?" I did not answer him because I did not have an answer, and because there is a kind of question that a person asks out loud only after they have already understood it. We stayed up there about 20 minutes. Lowell put the flowers down at the base of the stone the way he had put them down 36 times before out of habit, and then looked at them lying there and said something under his breath, and did not pick them back up. Before he walked me down to the cars, he said one thing that mattered. He said, "Whatever this is, it isn't going to be fixed by me." I said I did not know what you mean. "I mean I own the company he works for," he said. "As of June, which means anything I do from here gets looked at twice, and it should. If I go through that building tomorrow pulling files, then everything that comes out of it is a rich man settling something personal, and any lawyer in this town will say so, and most of them will be right." He looked out over the section for a second. "You don't need me to open doors, Junia. You need doors that open for you." I told him that no door in that company had opened for me in 34 years. He said, "Then find out why not. That is a different question than you think it is." I drove home and got there before Garrett and put the 2 certificates inside the steno case under the machine and closed the latches. I made dinner. He came in at 6:20. He asked how my day had been. I said quiet. The next morning I drove to Auburn. Peg Larkin lives in a brick ranch on the east side with a ramp on the front steps for a husband who has been gone since 2020 and a flag bracket with no flag in it. She is 71. She retired out of the courthouse in 2013 and got bored inside of a year, and has worked since as a part-time paralegal for a 2-attorney office in DeKalb County, doing the thing that people in her position always end up doing, which is knowing where every document in the state of Indiana actually lives. I had not spoken to her since the fall of 1994. I sat in my car in front of that house for 11 minutes. I want that in here because it is the truest thing in this entire account about what 34 years does to a person. I was 63 years old. I had my own name on a death certificate in my trunk, and I sat outside a house for 11 minutes trying to work out whether I was allowed to knock. She opened the door before I got to the step. She had seen the car. She looked at me for a long moment through the storm door, and she did not say Junia, and she did not say my God, and she did not say where have you been. She said, "Can you still read a page?" And I started to laugh, and then I did not, and she opened the door. We sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. I told her all of it, in order, which is the only way I know how to do anything. She got up twice, once for coffee, and once to find a pad, and she wrote the whole time in shorthand, which she has not needed to do professionally in 13 years, and which she did automatically the way I had put my hands on the machine. When I got to the end, she sat back and took her glasses off and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She said, "All right, here is what I want you to understand before we go 1 inch further." She said the thing about 1990 was over. She said it plainly, and she said it twice because she could see I did not want it. The forgery of a death record in 1990, the false entry, the misrepresentation to a family in Lawrence County. All of it happened 36 years ago, and there is not a prosecutor in this state who could charge a single count of it. She said the statute is the statute, and that it is there for reasons that are good, even when they are cruel. I said, then what is the point? She said the point is that 1990 is not a weapon. 1990 is character evidence. And you do not go after a man like that with the thing he did to you. You go after him with the thing he is still doing. I said I did not know of anything he was still doing. She said, neither do I. Let's find out what he's got his name on. And she opened her laptop. I want to explain this next part carefully because it is the hinge of everything and because it does not look like anything. When a funeral home in this state sells you a funeral in advance, which they do constantly, and which 1,900 families had done with my husband's company, the money you hand over is not theirs. It cannot be theirs. You are alive, the service has not been performed, and the law requires that those funds go into a trust and sit there until the day comes. There is a chapter of the Indiana Code that says so, and there is a state board that watches it. And every year the seller has to file a report with that board showing the balances and identifying who is holding the money. Those reports are filed with a state agency, which means they are records, which means a person may ask for them. Peg found the most recent one in about 9 minutes. She turned the laptop around and slid it across the table to me and put her finger on the screen on the 3rd page in a block of small type under the heading for the trustees of record. It said Garrett R. Whitlock, and under that it said Junia P. Whitlock. I looked at it for a while. I said, that's a mistake. Peg said, scroll up. The report for the year before said it too, and the one before that. She went back one at a time, and it was there in 2019, and it was there in 2015, and the earliest one the state had online was 2011, and it was there too. I said, I have never in my life been a trustee of anything. Peg put her glasses back on and looked at me over the top of them, and I watched a woman who has spent 50 years around courtrooms arrive at a conclusion about 140 feet ahead of me. She said, Junia, listen to what you just told me. You are a trustee of that fund. I said, no, I am not. She said, that is not what the state of Indiana thinks. And what the state of Indiana thinks is the only thing in this room that has any power. It took me until she said it a third way. A trustee is not an honor. A trustee is a job. A trustee has duties, and a trustee has liabilities, and a trustee has one thing that nobody on earth can take away from her, which is the absolute right to know what is in the trust she is responsible for. You cannot hide a trust from its own trustee. There is no version of that. The moment my name went on that report, whoever put it there handed me a key and did not think about it, because he did not think of me as a person who opens things. Peg wrote the letter that afternoon, and I signed it, and I sent it certified on Wednesday the 14th to the corporate office, and to the trustee bank, and to the state board, all 3, because Peg said you never send a thing like that to one place. It was 4 paragraphs. It identified me by name as a trustee of record of the Whitlock Memorial Group Preneed Trust as reported to the board. It requested in my capacity as trustee the complete records of the trust, including all instruments, all amendments, all annual accountings, and all disbursement authorizations for the period from 2009 forward. It cited the chapter. It gave 10 days. Peg made me put in the last line myself. She said it should be in my voice. The last line said I am also requesting copies of every document in the file bearing my signature. The call came on Friday morning at 9:50. It was not Garrett. It was a woman from the trustee bank in Indianapolis, very polite, wanting to confirm my identity and my mailing address. And she said the records were extensive and asked whether I would prefer them electronically or whether I wanted to come and review the originals. I said originals. She said the operating records were held at the company, and that under the circumstances she would recommend I review the trust file at their office. And I understood from the way she said under the circumstances that somebody at that bank had already read the 2nd page of my letter twice. I drove down on Monday the 19th. It took me 6 hours, and I did not eat. They put me in a conference room with a window and a box. Here is what was in it. 11 documents dated between March of 2009 and August of 2024. Each one bearing my name, and each one bearing a signature. 3 of them were annual certifications, the kind of form where a trustee attests that the accounting is accurate. 6 of them were disbursement authorizations, which is the document that permits money to come out of a pre-need trust and go somewhere else. 1 was a 2016 amendment to the trust instrument itself, adding a class of permitted expenses that had not been permitted before. And one dated the 11th of March in 2021 was a consent for the trust to hold a note. I had never seen any of them. I had never been in a room where any of them existed. On the date of one of them, I had been in Michigan at a funeral for one of Nadine's sisters, and I could prove it, and later I did. The signatures were good. I want to be honest about that too, because it would be a better story if they were sloppy, and they were not. Whoever did it had a genuine exemplar and had practiced. The slant was right. The size was right. The way the pen lifts between the second and third letter was right. The J was wrong. I sat in that conference room with those 11 pages laid out in a row, and I got the steno pad out of my bag, the practice pad from 1988 with my name on the cover, and I put it at the end of the row. When you certify a transcript, you sign it. Everyone. Under a statement that says the foregoing is a true and complete record, and you do it at the end of a day when your hands are finished, and you do it hundreds of times a year for years. And what happens to a signature under those conditions is that it stops being handwriting and becomes a motion. Mine had one. On the capital J at the bottom of the descender, my pen kicks back to the left and comes up and crosses the foot of the letter before it goes on. It is not decorative. It is a place where a tired hand cheats, and it started sometime in 1990, and it never left. I did not do it on the pad in 1988 because in 1988 I did not have it yet. Whoever forged those 11 documents had used something from before 1990. And then I sat back in that chair in Indianapolis and understood the second half of it, which is the half that had nothing to do with handwriting. 6 disbursement authorizations. A 2016 amendment permitting a new class of expense. A 2021 consent for the trust to hold a note, which is a polite way of saying that instead of money, the trust was now holding a promise from somebody to pay money later. There was one other thing in that box, and at the time it meant nothing to me at all. 3 of the 6 disbursement authorizations had a second signature block at the bottom, under a line that said prepared and attested by, and on those 3 there was a name I knew. Darcy L. Whitlock, Records Manager, dated 2019, 2021, and 2022. Those signatures were real. I knew they were real the way you know your own child's handwriting on a form, because I had watched that hand learn cursive at my kitchen table in 1994, and it had never gotten any better, and the lowercase y still had that flat, lazy tail. I looked at it and I thought she must have been in the room. I thought she must have carried them in and out. And then I put it aside because there were 11 pages with my own name on them, and I did not have room in my head for anything else, and it did not come back to me until the 18th of November, sitting on the bottom stair. I asked the woman from the bank for the current balance and the current obligation. She had it ready. I think she had had it ready since Friday. 1,904 active contracts. The obligation, which is to say what those families had paid in and what was owed to them. The day their day came was a little over $11 million. The trust held 6.8. $4.2 million was not there. In its place, there was a note, and the note was signed by Whitlock Memorial Group, and the disbursements that had moved that money out over 15 years had been authorized by 2 trustees, one of whom was me. I sat in a rented conference room, and I did the arithmetic that I have been doing my whole life, and it came out somewhere I had never been. It was not that my husband had stolen from 1,900 families, though he had. It was not even that he had used my hand to do it, though he had. It was that he had built himself a second person. If it ever came apart, there would not be one man standing in front of a judge. There would be 2 trustees who had both signed, and one of them would be a woman with no employment history since 1994, no professional record, no independent accounts, no memory of the transactions, and a husband with 34 years of documented patience about her. He did not put my name on that trust to give me something. He put it there to have somewhere to stand. I drove back to Fort Wayne on Tuesday, and I did not go home. I went to Peg's, and I put it all on her kitchen table, and she read for 40 minutes without a word, and then she got up and stood at the sink with her back to me for a while. She said, "You have to stop doing this the way you are doing it." I said I did not understand. "You've been going and getting things," she said, "one at a time, like a person clearing a shelf. That is fine when you don't know what you're looking at." She came back and sat down. "You know what you're looking at now. So from here you are going to build a record, and you are going to build it in the order somebody else can follow, because at some point a person who has never met you is going to have about 40 minutes to understand 15 years, and whether they do is going to depend entirely on how you stack the paper." She tore a page off the pad and wrote me a list. Number 1, the annual reports from the board, all years certified, not printouts. Number 2, my own signature exemplars, and she underlined that twice. Number 3, the licensing file. Number 4, a lawyer, and she wrote a name, Harriet Vance, and a phone number and said call her Thursday, and do not be charming about it, just hand her the box. I asked her about number 2. I said I have the marriage license from 1992 and I have the pad. And Peg Larkin looked at me across her kitchen table and said the sentence that I think about more than any other sentence anybody said to me that entire autumn. She said, Junia, you worked in that courthouse for 6 years. Where do you think your transcripts are? They are in the record room on the ground floor of the Allen County Courthouse, and they are in the appellate record, and they are attached to hundreds of case files, and every single one of them has a page at the back with a certification on it, and my original signature underneath, executed under oath, dated and filed by the clerk of a court. There are, by the count that was eventually put in front of a judge, 461 of them. I went down there on the Thursday, and I stood in that room which smells the same as it smelled in 1991, and I put in a request, and a young man about Darcy's age brought out the first 4 boxes on a cart, and I opened the top one, and there was a transcript from March of 1992 in a matter about a fence, and I turned to the back page, Junia A. Prewitt, RPR, and the J kicked back to the left and crossed its own foot. I stood in that basement for a long time, because for 32 years I had let a man tell me that the 6 years I spent in that building were something that had happened to me, that they were a phase or a habit or an exposure to filth. And the whole time on the ground floor of a courthouse, 20 minutes from my kitchen in 461 places, there was a woman's oath with her name under it. He never thought about it once. That is the thing. In 34 years of managing every account and every password and every piece of paper that came into that house, it never once occurred to Garrett Whitlock that the woman he had put in the attic had left 461 certified specimens of her own hand in the public record of Allen County, Indiana, because he did not think that what I had done was the kind of thing that leaves a record. Harriet Vance took the box on the 6th of November. She was about 50 gray suit small office on Wayne Street, and she read for 2 hours while I sat there. And when she was done, she asked me exactly one question, which was whether I had ever on any occasion told my husband that I did not want to know about the finances. I said yes, probably many times. She wrote that down and said, good, that's what they'll use. Now I know where it is. The name Delbert Kirkland came out of a ledger, not a company ledger, a personal one. Garrett kept his own household book in the bottom drawer of the desk in the den, a hardbound cash book he had kept since 1986, and I had dusted around that drawer for 34 years and never opened it, and on the 9th of November I opened it. It was not hidden. That is what I want people to understand about a house like that. Nothing was hidden. It did not have to be. From July of 1990 through October of 1994, at irregular intervals there was an entry in his hand that said Kirkland and an amount. 22 entries. The first one was large, the rest were not. Peg found him in about 20 minutes. Delbert R. Kirkland, licensed private investigator in this state from 1979 until he let it lapse in 2003, business address on Coldwater Road, no complaints, no actions, 79 years old, and a listing from 6 weeks earlier in the residence directory of the Rivergreen Hospice House out on Maple Crest. I want to say what I felt when I saw that address, because it was not what a person should feel. What I felt was that I had gotten there in time, and I have not entirely forgiven myself for the shape of that thought. I went on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of November. He was in a chair by a window with an oxygen line and a blanket over his knees, and a television going with no sound. He was a big man once. You could see it in the frame of him. I sat down and said my name and said that I was married to Garrett Whitlock, and I watched his face do something that answered the entire question before he opened his mouth. He said, I wondered. I said, wondered what? He said whether anybody was ever going to come. He talked for about 50 minutes and he had to stop 3 times. I did not record it. I want that in the record because it was the one thing in the whole autumn that I got wrong procedurally and right in every other way. He was 79 and he was dying, and I was not going to sit in front of him with a telephone on the arm of the chair. He said that in the spring of 1990, he was 33 years old and 18 months into his own business and behind on a truck payment. He said Garrett Whitlock came to him in May with a job that was, in his words, mostly a delivery. There was a package. Delbert did not assemble it. He was very clear about that, and I believed him about it. He picked it up at the Broadway home in a brown accordion file, and he was told what was in it, and he was told where it went, which was the offices of Tolliver and Reed on Berry Street, to be left with the receptionist for the attention of a partner with a compliments card and no return. Inside there were 3 things: a certified copy of a death certificate, a memorial card, and a photograph of a headstone in a cemetery taken from about 8 feet with enough of the row in the frame to show it was a real place. He said the job that came after was the part he had thought about since. He said Whitlock did not pay him to keep anybody from finding her. He said that would have been impossible, and that anybody who tells you different has never done the work. He said what he was paid to do was watch and see whether the other side started up again, and that for 4 years he made a monthly telephone call to a girl in the records office at Tolliver and Reed, who he took to lunch twice a year, and if a file was reopened or an inquiry went out, he would have heard about it in a week. I asked him if it ever did. He said no. He said not once. He said, "That's the thing about paper, ma'am. You only have to be believed one time." I asked him why he kept a copy. He looked out the window for a while, and then he said that in 1994 the payment stopped, and he asked why, and he was told it was finished, and he said that he sat in his truck outside that funeral home and thought about the fact that he had never once been asked to find out whether the woman on the certificate was alive. He said a man hires an investigator to find something out. He hired me to make sure nobody looked. In 15 years, nobody had ever hired me for that. He said the copy had been in a footlocker since 1994 and had moved 4 times and was now in a storage unit on Lima Road, and he told me the number of the unit and where the key was, and his daughter brought it to Harriet Vance's office 11 days later. Before I left, he said one more thing. He said, "I never knew there was a baby." I said, "I know." He said, "I want that said out loud because I'll be dead in a month and I'd rather it was said out loud." I did not know there was a baby. Delbert Kirkland died on the 29th of December. Harriet had gotten a sworn statement out of him on the 2nd of December in that chair, with a notary and a videographer, and it ran 41 minutes, and it was the last work he ever did. The recording at the kitchen table was on the 20th of November. Harriet told me the law in one sentence. In this state, a person who is a party to a conversation may record that conversation, and the consent of the other party is not required. She told me not to lead him, not to accuse him, not to ask anything I already had a document for, and to ask one question and then be quiet. She said the silence is the tool, not the question. I put my phone face down on the table next to the salt. He came in at 6:20 the way he did. He ate. He talked about a service on Saturday and about a man on the board who had had a stroke. I waited until he put his fork down. I said, "Garrett, where is my child buried?" I have listened to that recording since with other people in the room, which is its own particular experience, and there is a stretch of 8 seconds there where nobody says anything. Then he said that was finished 36 years ago. I did not say anything. He said, "You signed for it. You were in no condition, and I did what I do for people, and I have never once asked you for a thank you." I did not say anything. And then he said the sentence that Harriet Vance played to a judge in December and to the state board in the spring. He said, "There is nothing out there for you." Out there. I had not said where. I had not said a cemetery. I had not said a name. I had not said the word ground. I had said the word buried and nothing else. And a man who had spent 34 years being careful in that house was tired at the end of a Tuesday, and he put a direction on it. He knew where. He knew where in a way that had a location attached to it. And that location was not in this house, and it was out. I said all right, and I got up and cleared the plates. The petition was served on the 18th. It came to the door at 4:10 in the afternoon by a deputy who was about 25 and who was extremely polite and who called me ma'am 4 times. I signed for it standing in my own front hall. In the Allen Superior Court Probate Division, in the matter of the guardianship of Junia P. Whitlock, an alleged incapacitated person, Petitioner Garrett R. Whitlock's spouse. I sat down on the bottom stair, which is where I had been standing on the 9th of October when he told me he was not upset with me, and I read it all the way through twice. It said that the respondent was 63 years of age. It said that over the preceding 18 months, the petitioner had observed a progressive decline. It said that the respondent had become preoccupied with events from the distant past and had begun to make statements about her own identity and history that were demonstrably false. It said that on the 9th of October, at a public function attended by more than 200 people, the respondent had approached a business associate of the petitioner and made statements of a personal nature that had caused significant embarrassment. It said that the respondent had recently been engaging in unsupervised financial and legal correspondence, including with a state agency, and that the petitioner was concerned about exposure to fraud. It requested a guardianship over both the person and the estate. Attached were 2 affidavits. The first was from Arlen Boyce, M.D., and it recited that he had examined the respondent on the 3rd of November and had administered a standard cognitive screening instrument, and it gave a score and it offered an opinion. I had gone to that appointment. Of course I had gone. My husband had made it for me on a Saturday morning in October in a soft voice, and I had gone on a Tuesday in November and sat in a room, and a doctor I had never met asked me to remember 3 words and to draw the face of a clock and to count backward. And I had thought at the time that it was a strange thing to include in a general workup, and I had done what I had been trained by 34 years to do, which is to assume that the man in front of me knew what the appointment was for. I did not score well. I want to be honest about that too. I had not slept properly since the 9th of October, and I had spent that morning at a courthouse record room, and I sat down in a chair in a strange office and was asked to draw a clock. The second affidavit was 1 page. I have read a great many documents in my life professionally and otherwise, and I have never had one do to me what that page did. It was signed by Darcy L. Whitlock. It gave her relationship to the respondent as niece by marriage. It stated that the affiant had known the respondent for 33 years and had resided in her household as a minor. It stated that the affiant had observed over the past year occasions on which the respondent appeared disoriented, repeated herself, and expressed beliefs about her past that the affiant knew to be untrue. It stated that on the 9th of October, the affiant had personally observed the respondent standing alone in a service corridor holding a serving tray, unable to explain what she was doing there. She had asked me for the tray. She had come around the end of the coat rack with her lanyard on and said hi, and I had said hello, sweetheart, and she had said the caterer needed the tray, and I had handed it to her, and she had taken it and walked back out into the light. That was the observation. I sat on that stair with the paper in my hand, and I thought about a girl who could not sleep without the hall light on. And then sitting there, the other thing came back to me. Prepared and attested by Darcy L. Whitlock, Records Manager, 2019, 2021, 2022. 3 disbursement authorizations moving money that was not the company's out of a trust that was short by $4.2 million, and every one of them carried her name in her own hand under a line that said she had prepared it and attested to it. I put the petition down on the stair beside me, because I could see it. I could see the whole conversation in an office in that building sometime in the first 2 weeks of November, after a certified letter went to a bank in Indianapolis, and the bank called the company. I could see him sitting on the corner of her desk the way he did. I could see him being reasonable. I could see him explaining to a woman of 41 whose entire working life had been inside that company exactly which 3 pieces of paper had her signature on them, and exactly what a person on the outside would make of them, and then telling her that none of it would ever have to be looked at by anybody, so long as the question of whether his wife was competent got settled quietly and soon. He had done to her the identical thing he had done to me. He had put her name on something, and then he had used the name. The difference was that Darcy was in the room when it happened. Then I called Harriet Vance, and she said one word which was good, and I said, "What?" She said, "He filed, Junior, he filed. He has just put every single thing you have in front of a judge on his own motion at his own expense, and now he cannot get it out again." The hearing was on the 9th of December at 9:30 in the morning in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Allen County Courthouse. I had not been in that building as a working professional since the fall of 1994. The record room where I had stood in November is 1 floor down and at the other end. The elevator is the same elevator. Harriet asked me on the way up whether I wanted to testify or whether I wanted her to do it. I said I would do it. She said, "Then do not perform. He is going to sit there looking like a tired husband. If you get angry, he wins the whole morning." I said, "I understand." She said, "You know what a record is. Make one." He was already at the petitioner's table when we came in, gray suit hands folded. He looked up at me, and he did the thing that I had not braced for, which was that his face went soft and sad, and he gave me a small nod, the kind you give somebody you are worried about. Darcy was in the 2nd row on his side with her coat still on. She was clicking a pen. I want to tell this part the way it happened, rather than the way it felt, because the way it felt is not evidence. Harriet went in 3 movements. The first was Dr. Boyce. She did not attack his medicine. She asked him 4 questions. Whether he had a service agreement with the Rivergreen Hospice House. Whether he was aware that the Rivergreen Hospice House holds a contract for funeral and removal services with Whitlock Memorial Group executed in 2017 and renewed annually. Whether he had disclosed that relationship to the respondent at any time before or during the examination. And whether he had informed the respondent at any point on the 3rd of November that the purpose of the appointment was an evaluation of her cognition. He said no to the last 2. The second movement was the paper. Harriet put up the 1992 marriage license. Then she put up 9 certified transcripts pulled from the record of that very courthouse, and she noted for the court that there were 452 more where those came from. Then she put up the 11 trust documents, and she put my J next to their J blown up 4 inches tall, and she did not say a word about it for a full 10 seconds, which I understand now was the most expensive 10 seconds of that entire morning. Then she called me. I sat in the chair to the left of the bench, which is about 6 feet from the chair I sat in for 6 years, and I was sworn, and Harriet asked me to state my name for the record. And I said Junia Ann Prewitt Whitlock. She took me through it in order. The badge, the card, the health department, the 2 documents, the section and the row, the trust report, the letter, the box in Indianapolis. She did not once ask me how I felt about any of it, and I have thanked her for that. At the end, she said, Mrs. Whitlock, your husband has told this court that you are confused about your own identity and your own history. Is there anything you want to say about that? And I said the thing I had written down on a card in the car and had then left in the car. I said, Your Honor, my husband's position is that I am confused about who I am. On the 11th of April, 1990, my husband signed a certificate of death in my name and filed it with this county, and it is still on file today, and his license number is on the bottom of it. He has had 36 years to correct that record, and he has not corrected it. I would ask the court to decide which of us has been confused about who I am. Nobody moved. The judge took the exhibit from Harriet's hand and looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at my husband, and then he looked at the certificate again. He denied the petition from the bench. He said on the record that he found no clear and convincing evidence of incapacity, that he found the evaluation to have been obtained under circumstances he described as troubling, and that the court would be referring a copy of the exhibits to the Office of the Attorney General and to the state board that licenses funeral service in this state. He set the exhibits to remain under seal of the court. Then he said something that was not required, and that I have never forgotten. He said, Mrs. Whitlock, the record of this court will reflect that you are alive. Garrett did not look at me. He stood up when the bailiff said to, and he buttoned his jacket, and he walked out through the gate with his hand out for the door. I was gathering my things when I heard a chair. Darcy had stood up in the second row. She had her coat over her arm and her mouth open, and no sound was coming out of it. And she stood there in the middle of an emptying courtroom, 41 years old, with a pen in her fist. I looked at her for about 3 seconds. Then I picked up my bag and I walked past her and out into the hall, and I got in the elevator, and I did not cry until I reached the car. Harriet Vance filed 3 things in the week before Christmas, and she filed them on the same day on purpose. She explained why in her office with the box open between us. She said that a man in Garrett's position survives by handling one thing at a time, and that everything he had done for 36 years had worked because there had only ever been one of anything. 1 certificate, 1 card, 1 delivery, 1 quiet arrangement. She said, so we are going to hand him 3 in 3 different buildings, run by 3 sets of people who do not report to each other and cannot be asked to wait. The first went to the state board that licenses funeral service in Indiana. It was a complaint against the license of Garrett R. Whitlock, and it had 3 counts. That he had knowingly filed a false certificate of death with a local health officer in May of 1990. That the certifying physician's signature on that certificate was not the signature of the physician named, and that from 2009 forward, he had caused funds held in a pre-need trust to be disbursed for purposes not permitted, leaving an obligation of $11.2 million, secured by $6.8 million in assets, and a note from the company he ran. Harriet said the board was the piece I should understand best and worry about least. A license is not a criminal matter. The board is not a court, and it does not care about a statute of limitations because it is not punishing a crime. It is answering a question, and the question is whether this person should be permitted to continue holding a document that lets him sign for the dead. The second went to the Office of the Attorney General, and it was narrow on purpose. It did not mention 1990, except as background. Peg Larkin had been right about that in her kitchen in October, and Harriet said the same thing in different words in December. 11 counts of forgery on 11 instruments dated between March of 2009 and August of 2024, and a theft count on the trust. Every date inside the window. Every document sitting in a bank in Indianapolis with a chain of custody a first-year lawyer could recite. He will want the fight to be about 1990, Harriet said. 1990 is 36 years ago, and there is nothing left of it in law, and everyone in the room will be a little bit sorry for both of you. We are not going to give him that. He is going to have to stand up and explain a signature from 2021. The third was the one I signed myself. It was a petition in the probate division asking the court to declare that Junia Ann Prewitt, born the 9th of January 1963, was living, and to vacate the certificate of death filed under her name in May of 1990. That sounds like a formality. It is not a formality. Harriet made me sit and understand exactly what I was asking for, because it was the one thing in all of it that could not be taken back once it started moving. A court cannot simply cross out a death. There is a body in the arithmetic. The state's record said that a woman died on the 11th of April in 1990, that her remains were cremated, and that those remains were interred in a specific plot in a specific section of a specific cemetery in Allen County. If the court was going to hold that the woman was alive, the court had to answer the obvious next question, and the obvious next question is not rhetorical. Then who is in the ground? There is a chapter in the Indiana Code about disinterment. You do not need to be curious. You need an order, or you need the consent of the person with the legal right to control disposition, and I was on the face of every document in existence, exactly nobody. Harriet wrote it in one line. In order to grant the relief requested, the court will be required to determine the identity of the remains interred at Fairmount Memorial Gardens, Section 14, Row 9. I signed it on the 17th of December. Delbert Kirkland died on the 29th. His daughter called me. She said he had asked her to. Lowell did exactly one thing, and he did it on the 6th of January, and he did it in the most boring way available to him. He did not go through that building pulling files. He wrote a letter to the operating officers of Whitlock Memorial Group, placing Garrett R. Whitlock on administrative suspension, pending an independent audit of the Pre-Need Trust engaged an outside firm out of Chicago that had no prior work with any entity he owned, and instructed them to report to the board of the holding company, and not to him. Then he stayed out of it for 11 weeks, which I have come to understand was harder for him than anything else he did that year. The audit found the trust in 6 days. Anybody would have. It was not hidden either. What the audit found in the 4th week was the cemetery. I got the call from a young woman on the audit team who did not know who I was and who wanted to ask a question about a transaction from 2004, and she was reading me a number off a schedule when I asked her to stop and say the name again. Fairmount Memorial Gardens, acquired by Whitlock Memorial Group in November of 2004 for $1.6 million. She said the reason it had come up was that they could not make it work. It had never made money. It had not made money in 2004, and it had not made money in any year since, and the appraisal in the file done by the seller put the whole property at about $900,000. Whitlock had paid $1.6 in cash and a 5-year note at a time when the company had no cash and had just come off 2 bad years, and the young woman said the word that auditors say when they do not want to say anything, which was anomalous. I drove down to Indianapolis on a Thursday and sat with the file myself. Fairmount had been owned since 1948 by a family named Loudermilk. In 2003, the last of them put it up. There were 2 offers. One was from Whitlock. The other was from a regional operator out of Ohio, and their letter of intent was in the file, and it was 4 pages, and on the 3rd page was a schedule of planned capital work. Fairmount sits on a slope with a clay shelf under it, and it has had water in the low ground on the north side since the 60s. The Ohio company's plan addressed it. They were going to put in a drain field, regrade the north slope, and because you cannot regrade ground that has people in it, they were going to petition for relocation of the interments in the 2 oldest sections on that slope, sections 12 and 14. I sat in a rented office in Indianapolis in January and looked at a 4-page letter written in 2003 by a company in Ohio that had never heard of me and understood why a man with no cash had paid $700,000 over the number for a cemetery he did not want. He did not buy a cemetery. He bought the right to say no to anyone who ever proposed to move Section 14. For 14 years after that, he ran that place at a loss and paid the mowing and kept the water in the low ground and never fixed the drainage because fixing the drainage was the thing that would have required moving the ground. The court heard the petition on the 11th of February and granted it in part. The judge would not declare me living not yet, and Harriet had told me he would not. He held that the relief requested could not be granted on the record before him, that the record before him could not be completed without a determination of the identity of the remains, and that the interests involved were sufficient to justify the order. He ordered disinterment of the remains at Section 14, Row 9, under the supervision of the Allen County Coroner's Office with a representative of the State Board present at a date to be set by the court. He set it for the 9th of March at 8 in the morning. Garrett came to the house on the 8th. He had been in an apartment out on Illinois Road since the 2nd week of January. I had stayed. Harriet arranged it, and I do not know the details, and I did not ask for them, and I am aware that a great many women in my position do not get to stay, and that the only reason I did is that I had a lawyer 11 days after I had a document. He came at about 7 in the evening, and he stood on the step and did not come in. He looked bad. I am not going to enjoy saying that, and I am not going to pretend I did not notice. He was 68, and he had been suspended for 9 weeks from the only thing he had ever been, and it had come off him faster than I would have believed. His coat was not right on him. He said, "Can I say something?" I said, "You can say it there." He did not argue with that. He put his hands in his pockets and he looked out at the street for a while, and then he said the only completely honest sentence I ever heard out of him in 34 years of marriage. He said, "I never thought you'd go looking." I did not say anything. "In 34 years, he said, you never went looking for anything. Not once. Not a bank statement, not a password, not a phone number." He was not accusing me. That is the strange part. He said it the way a man reads back a measurement. I built the whole thing on that. And I said, "I know. That's what you did to me." He stood there. Then he made the offer, and I had known it was coming since I saw his car, and it came out in the flat, rehearsed way of something a man has said to himself in a room. He said he would sign everything. The house, the accounts, the share, all of it without a fight. And he would take whatever the board did to him and whatever the state did to him, and he would not contest a word of any of it if I would go to Harriet Vance in the morning and withdraw the petition about the grave. I said, "Why that one?" And he said, "Because you don't want to see it." I have thought about those 6 words for a year. There was something in them that was almost the thing a decent man would have said, and that is exactly why they worked for 36 years. He had said it to me before. He had said it in a hospital room at 11 o'clock at night on the 11th of April in 1990, with clean shoes and a folder, and what he had said then was that I did not need to know where, and that I did not need to carry that. I was not protecting me in 1990, and he was not protecting me on my front step in 2027. Both times he was making a woman's not knowing into a kindness, and both times the not knowing was the whole of what he needed. I said, "You told me once I didn't need to know where. I have needed to know where for 36 years. I looked at me. I said good night, and I closed the door, and I stood in the hall with my hand on the wood and listened to his car until it got to the end of the street. The 9th of March was clear and about 28 degrees, and there had been frost. I want to set down who was there because it matters that it was not a private thing. There was a deputy coroner from Allen County and an investigator with her. There was a person from the state board with a clipboard and a camera. There was a representative appointed by the court. There was Harriet, and there was me, and there was Lowell, and there were 4 men from the cemetery, and there was a small machine and a great deal of handwork. The record said cremated remains of an adult female. I understand now, and I did not understand then, that everybody standing on that grass at 8 in the morning already had a theory. The coroner's people had one, and Harriet had one, and the man from the board had one. And every one of those theories was some version of the ordinary awful thing, which is that a funeral director in 1990 had needed a body to be somewhere, and had used what he had, and that the ground was going to give up a person that nobody had ever come looking for. I had that theory too. I want to be honest. I stood at the edge of that hole in a wool coat, and I braced myself for a woman. They went down about 4 feet with the machine, and then they stopped, and the rest was shovels and then trowels, and it took an hour and 40 minutes, and nobody talked much. The mower shed was open across the way, and somebody over there was running a compressor, and then stopped running it. And after that it was very quiet. I have been asked what you do for an hour and 40 minutes at the edge of an open grave, and the answer is nothing. There is nowhere to look. If you look down, you are looking at men working and they can feel it. If you look away, you are performing something. I looked at the row, 14 stones ahead of it, and I read all 14 twice, and I have them still. A man born in 1901 and a woman born in 1904 with a single stone between them. A boy of 19 from 1968 with a service emblem on the corner. A woman whose stone said beloved mother and gave 3 sets of initials underneath which I had never seen done before, and which I thought was the most sensible thing on that whole hill. Every one of them said who somebody was. Every single one. 14 stones in a row, and not one of them stood over a person that nobody would say out loud belonged to them, and then there was the 15th. At about 9:15, a woman came up the hill from the office with a cardboard tray of coffee, and she did not say anything. She put it down on the flat top of a stone in the next row over and went back down, and I have thought about her since more than I have thought about most of the people who were officially there. At about 20 to 10, one of the men said, "I've got it." He came up and stood back, and the deputy coroner went down on the plank with the investigator. They were down there a long time. long enough that Harriet took a step closer to me and put her hand on my arm without looking at me. What came up was a metal container about 15 inches long, 16 at most gray, sealed at the seam with a lid that fastened at 4 points. It had a paper label on the lid under a plastic film that had gone brown, and there was a number stamped into the metal at one end. 15 inches. A person who is going to be cremated comes back in a container about the size of a bread box, and I had been in that family for 34 years, and I had seen 500 of them, and this was not one of them. It was too long, and it was the wrong shape, and it was made of the wrong thing, and I knew that before anybody said a word, and so did the deputy coroner, and so did the man from the board, who took 2 steps forward without meaning to. The deputy coroner read the number off the end of it out loud for the record. It was a hospital record number. It had the format the county hospital used until they changed systems in 1997, and it began with the year 90. They did not open it there. That is not how it is done, and I did not want them to, and I am glad they did not. It went into the vehicle, and it went to the coroner's office on Wallace Street, and it was opened at 11:40 that morning with the court's representative present, and with Harriet present, and with me in the corridor. The deputy coroner came out at 12:15 and sat down next to me on a bench in a hallway, and did not use any of the words that people use. She said, "There are no cremated remains in that container." I said, "All right." She said, "There are skeletal remains. They are not those of an adult." And then she said the thing, and she said it slowly, and she watched my face while she said it, which I believe was on purpose, and which I believe was kindness. She said, "The measurements are consistent with a fetus at approximately 20 weeks. I will need the laboratory to confirm, and I am not going to tell you anything today that I cannot stand behind. But I have been doing this for 19 years, and I am telling you what I saw." I said, "Thank you. I have been asked what I felt, and I have given a different answer every time, and none of them has been right. I will try once more. I did not feel grief. Grief had been used up on the 11th of April in 1990, and in the 6 months after it, and in 100 nights across 36 years, and there was not a fresh supply of it lying around. What I felt sitting on a bench in a county building at 12:15 was something I can only describe as the floor coming back. For 36 years there had been a thing about my life that did not add up, and I had carried the not adding up as though it were a personal defect. That is what he built. Not a lie, a defect. He arranged the world so that the thing that was wrong appeared to be me. And at 12:15 on the 9th of March, a woman in a county building said a number out loud, and the arithmetic closed. Lowell was outside. He had not come into the building. He had stood in the parking lot for the whole 4 hours in the cold with his hands in his coat, because he had said in the car that this was mine, and that he was not going to be in the room for it, and I went out and found him standing by the front of his truck. I told him. He did not say anything for a long moment. He looked at me, and then he looked past me at the building, and I watched a very large man of 65 years old lose the use of his legs in a slow and completely silent way, and he got a hand on the fender and went down and sat on the cold asphalt of a county parking lot with his back against his own front tire. He said, "Every year." I said, "I know." He said, "Every year on the 11th of April I drove up here, and I got down on that grass and I talked to you. And I sat down on the asphalt next to him, because there was nothing else in the world to do, and we stayed there a while and the cars came in and out and nobody bothered us." The laboratory report came on the 30th of March. The comparison was straightforward, and the conclusion was not qualified. The remains recovered from Section 14, Row 9 of Fairmount Memorial Gardens were the remains of the biological child of Junia Ann Prewitt and Lowell Carlisle Ashby. Harriet called me and read it to me over the telephone, and then she said, "Do you want me to come over?" And I said no, and then I said yes, and she came. The state board sat on the 20th of April in a hearing room in Indianapolis with a long table and bad light, and 11 people in the audience. It went 4 hours, and I will give you the shape of it. The first count was of the certificate. They put it on the screen, and the board members had it in front of them, in paper, and the room got very quiet in the way that a room of professionals gets quiet when they are looking at a thing from inside their own trade. Every person at that table had signed 1,000 of those. They knew exactly what every line was for, and they knew exactly what a blank in the wrong place meant. And there was a woman at the end of the table who put her glasses on to look at the Social Security line, and then took them off and looked up at Garrett, and did not look back down again for the rest of the morning. The second count was Wendell Faust. Dr. Faust died in 1996, and I had assumed that was the end of it. And it was not because a physician who practices for 31 years signs his name on tens of thousands of things, and a great many of them are in medical records that hospitals keep for a very long time. But Harriet did not use those. Harriet used one document, and it is the one that I did not know existed until the 12th of January of that year, when she told me she had requested it, and I had to go sit in the other room. On the 11th of April in 1990, a report of fetal death was made to the state of Indiana. That is required at 20 weeks, and it happened and it is real. It has my name on it as the mother, and it has the hospital and the date and the time, and it has Wendell Faust's signature on it, executed that night by his own hand in the building 4 hours before Garrett Whitlock walked in with clean shoes. Harriet put the two signatures side by side on the screen. The real one from the fetal death report and the one from my certificate of death filed a month later. They are not close. Whoever wrote the second one had seen the first one, but not for long. And there was one more thing on that report, and it was the thing that took the last of the air out of the room. The report had a line for the disposition of the remains, and it said that the remains had been released to Whitlock Memorial Group on the 12th of April in 1990, and the state's file had nothing after that. No final disposition ever reported. A permit opened in April of 1990, and never once closed for 37 years in the file of a man who had sat for his license in this state and had renewed it every 2 years since. The third count was the trust, and it took 90 minutes, and it was the least interesting part of the day, and it was the one that will follow him longest. Garrett spoke once. He had counsel, and counsel did the talking, and counsel was competent and did the only thing there was to do, which was to keep saying that the 1990 matters were remote in time and outside the board's proper concern. The chair let him say it 3 times and then said without any particular heat that the board was not being asked to punish It was being asked whether the person in front of it should be signing death certificates in 2027, and that the board found 1990 highly relevant to that question. Near the end, one of the members asked Garrett directly whether he wished to address the certificate. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket, which he did whenever he stood in any room for any reason. He said, "I was 32 years old. I made an error in a very difficult situation, and I have carried it." And then he sat down. That was it. That was the entire statement of a man who had held a license in this state for 42 years, and it lasted 11 seconds. And I sat in the second row and understood something that had taken me a year to be able to hold, which is that there was never going to be an explanation. There was no room at the bottom of him where a reason was being kept. He had wanted a thing, and there had been a way to get it, and the way had involved a form, and he had filled out the form. They let me speak at the end. 14 minutes. I had written 6 pages, and I did not use them. I did not talk about the gala, and I did not talk about the badge, and I did not talk about the 11th of April in 1990, and I did not talk about the marriage, because none of that was any of their business, and because a licensing board is not the place where a woman gets to be heard about her life. I said one thing about myself, which was my name, and then I said that I had been a certified court reporter in this state from 1988 until 1994, and that I understood what a record was for. And then I read them the number, 1,904 families. I said what a pre-need contract is, which every one of them knew better than I did, and I said it anyway out loud into a microphone that it is a thing a person does when they are frightened of being a burden, that it is bought almost entirely by people over 70 on fixed income in the 6 months after a spouse dies, and that the reason they buy it is so that their children will not have to make a phone call on the worst day of their lives. I said that $4.2 million of that money was not there. I said that not one of those 1,904 people knew. The board revoked this license permanently. It was not close, and it did not take long. The order came out in writing in May, and it uses the phrase conduct fundamentally incompatible with the trust reposed in a licensee, and it does not include the words wife or marriage anywhere in it, which I have always been glad about. The Attorney General filed in the 2nd week of May. 11 counts of forgery, 1 count of theft, 1 count of corrupt business influence. He entered a plea in August to 4 of the forgery counts and the theft. Sentencing was set for November. He was 69 years old by then, and he will never hold a license in any state again, and that more than any of the rest of it is the part that ended him, because Garrett Whitlock was never a wealthy man, and was never a powerful man. He was a licensed one. That was the whole thing. The license was the room he stood in, and somebody took the room away. Whitlock Memorial Group went into temporary management in June. The 4 homes are still open under other names, and the people who work in them still have jobs, and I have made a point of knowing that. Darcy came to the house on a Saturday in May. She did not call first. She pulled into the drive at about 10 in the morning and got out and opened the back of her car, and by the time I got to the door, she had 2 file boxes on the ground and was reaching for a third. She did not apologize. I have thought about that, and I have decided that it was the only intelligent thing available to her, and that she knew it. She said December 9th to December 19th. He was still in the building and nobody had changed the locks yet. I said, what is it? She said everything. 10 days. I did the 2004 acquisition file, all of it, and the monument shop work orders back to 1988, and the interment cards for Section 14, and I did the removal log for April of 1990. She stopped and got her breath. The removal log is in the second box. He signed it. The 11th of April, 11:40 at night, in his own hand. I stood there in my own doorway and looked at a woman of 41 whom I had raised from the age of 8, and who had sworn out a paper that said I could not explain what I was doing in a hallway. She said, I'm not going to ask you for anything. I said, all right. She said, I signed 3 of them, in 2019, in 2021, and 2022. I prepared them, and I attested them, and I did not read them, and he came into my office on the 11th of November, and he closed the door, and he told me exactly what that meant. She was not crying. Her voice was doing something else, something flat and effortful. And I want to say out loud that I knew it was a lie when I signed it, because if I say I was confused, then I am doing to myself what he did to you. I did not hug her. People want that. There was no version of that morning where I hugged her. I took the boxes. I said, put them in the hall. And she carried them in one at a time and set them against the wall and went back out to her car. And at the end of the drive, she stopped and rolled the window down and said, Aunt Junia, and I said, not yet. She said, okay. I have seen her 4 times since. The 4th time was in September, and she stayed for lunch. I do not know where it goes, and I am 64 years old, and I have decided that not knowing where a thing goes is allowed. The order vacating the death record was entered on the 14th of June, 2027. It is 1 page. It recites the finding, it identifies the certificate by its state file number, and it directs the state registrar to amend the record. My copy is in a frame in the hall now, which Peg Larkin says is morbid, and which I intend to keep doing. We did not replace the stone. Lowell wanted to at first. He is a man who has spent his life selling rock, and his first instinct was to take that one out of the ground and put in something better, and he had a whole thing about a piece he had been holding in the yard at Bedford for 11 years. I said no. I said that stone came out of your ground, and it sat on my child for 37 years, and it is not going to a landfill. They took it to the shop in Bedford in July. They set it on the bench, and they took the face down about 3/8 of an inch, which takes the old letters off and leaves the stone, and then they cut it again. I chose the words. I did not choose many. The old one had my name on it, and 2 years and nothing else. Nothing to say she was anybody's anything. I had stood in front of it in October, and that had been the thing I could not get past more than the name, more than the years. So the new one says, Ellis Prewitt Ashby, under that the 11th of April, 1980, and under that child of Junia and Lowell. There is no verse on it. I did not want a verse. I wanted a relation. The name I chose in a hospital bed on the 12th of April in 1990, and never said to another living person for 37 years. My father was Hollis. I could not put his name on that child because I could not have said it out loud, so I took his and changed 1 letter and kept it in my mouth for most of my life. We set it on a Tuesday in August with nobody there but the 2 of us, and a man from the shop, and Lowell paid for the cutting, and I paid for the setting, and we argued about that for about 4 minutes, which was the first ordinary argument we had had since 1990. We are not married. People ask. Nadine Culp asks about every 6 weeks in a way she thinks is subtle. We hold the deed to that plot jointly, which took a court order, and which is the only piece of paper either of us has ever cared about. He drives up on the 2nd Sunday of the month. I sold the house in Aboite in September, and I have a place on the north side of the river with 2 rooms and a view of a parking lot, and I have never in my life been so pleased with anything. The stenotype is on a table by the window. The 1988 practice pad is in the drawer under it. Peg Larkin comes on Thursdays. The first letters went out from the fund in the last week of July, 1904 of them, and I wrote the language myself, and Harriet took 2 sentences out of it and left the rest. I got 460 replies. I have all of them. A woman in Decatur wrote 3 lines to say that she had bought hers in 2013, 8 months after her husband died, and that she had not told her son, and that she would like to know whether she still did not have to tell her son. I wrote back that she did not. A man of 88 wrote a page and a half about a contract from 2009, and then at the bottom under the signature, he had added a postscript asking whether the funeral home was going to be all right, because the young man out there had been very good to him in February. That one sat on my desk for a week. Because that is the part that nobody who tells this story from the outside ever gets right. It was not a wicked building full of wicked people. There are men and women in those 4 homes who have sat up all night with families and driven out at 3 in the morning in an ice storm and done the work with their whole hearts. And one man at the top of it took 1,904 people's frightened, careful, decent money and moved it. And every one of those employees is going to spend the rest of their working life explaining a name. I wrote back to him and said yes. The gala was on the 8th of October. Same building, same lobby, same black granite, same fan lights, same corridor at the north end with the coat racks along it and the smell of wet wool. I was on the platform. There is a fund. It has a long name, and it was set up in July under the supervision of the court, and Ashby Stone and Land put in $4.2 million in cash so that the 1,904 families would be whole on the day it was announced, and not in 4 years when the receiver finishes liquidating. That is a loan against the recovery, and it will mostly come back, and it does not matter whether it does. I administer it. That is a paid position with an office and a telephone and a job description, and I am 64 years old, and it is the second job I have ever had. At about 8:30, the man running the evening handed me the microphone and asked me to introduce myself to the room. 240 people, some of the same ones. I did not say the name of the fund, and I did not say my title because I had thought about it in the car for the whole drive down, and I knew there was only one thing I was going to say in that building. I said my name is Junia Ann Prewitt. I was born in January of 1963. And I said I am alive. I still have the badge. It is in my wallet behind my license white plastic with a bent pin, and it says volunteer, and it says 47, and it does not say my name anywhere on it. People who know the story think I keep it as a trophy, and people who know me better think I keep it to remind myself what he did. Neither one is right. I keep it because a man handed me that badge in a doorway in front of a witness, and I looked down at a piece of plastic with a number on it and no name, and I put it on. That is the part. He did not pin it to my coat while I slept. He held it up, and I stood still for it the way I had stood still for 34 years. And if I ever forget that, then I will start believing this was a thing that was done to a woman who never had a say in it. And the woman it was done to is the only person who can tell you that is not true. I stood still for it because standing still was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was real. And I am not going to sit here at 64 and lie about the price of leaving a house where you have no money, no work, no record, and no name. But I stood still. And there is a difference between a woman who was silenced and a woman who was quiet, and I have spent a year learning it. And the difference is that only one of them can decide to stop. So I keep the badge, and every so often I take it out and look at the number, and then I put it back behind my license, which has my name on it and my photograph and my date of birth, and an expiration date in 2031, which I intend to be a nuisance about renewing.